My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Steve Goff. We're at Colene Clemens. It's July 19th, 2017. And Steve, we're going to start you off by asking you why wine?
Why wine? Oh, well, I'm originally from the Philadelphia area, so I did not grow up in the industry by any means. I grew far away from I grew up far away from the industry. So like a lot of people, I think I more came into wine probably coming from a family of my mother is a very good cook. Both my parents are always into food and somewhat into wine, not as much into wine, but into food. Mm-hmm. Grew up working in restaurants through high school and then into college. Back when I was an undergrad at University of Pennsylvania, that's when I probably started tending bar at a nice restaurant on campus, and that's when I really started getting introduced to wine. And then I had stuck around for a couple years. I managed the bar at the restaurant, and the dining room manager would have me sit in with him when all the distributors would come around tasting wine. So I really got into wine just by tasting wine and exploring wine. And then I relocated to the Bay Area in 1996. Started visiting Napa and Sonoma. At that point I was working in publishing. I was working for a book publisher over in Berkeley. And I just, got the wine bug. So I quit my job and I went and worked harvest. Did my first little bit of harvest work in 97, and then went back in 98 working at Carneros Creek. And that was it. So that led me back to I ended up going back to school and through the enology and viticulture program at Fresno State, and doing some part-time work for some folks while I was doing that, and then landed here I think somewhat on a fluke in 2001, up in the Willamette Valley, that is, not here at Colin Clemens.
So before we get back to that...
So that took you on a long, how do you get into wine?
Perfect, we love it. Before we get back to here, I'm curious, when you started to appreciate wine and drink wine, what were you drinking at that point? Was it French? Was it California? Was it a little bit of everything?
Little of everything, although I think I more got introduced to wines through European wines. And the first couple wines I can remember most distinctly were a Rioja and a Chianti. At least on the red front. But we were pouring a mix of wines where I was working, Californian and imported. Actually, it was there when I'd say the first bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir I can recall would have been the 93 Adelsheim. Which 93 ended up being one of my favorite vintages. But and then when I moved to the Bay Area, continued to explore wines, and it was always a mix for me. Of course, I was visiting the valley, visiting Napa and Sonoma, but I was also perusing wine shops and exploring imports as well.
So when you say you ended up in Oregon kind of on a fluke. So how did that happen?
Well, I was coming out of the program at Fresno State in 2001. As like any someone coming out of any program, you're looking for a job and an opportunity, and so you're firing off resumes in many different directions. And I happened to there was a posting for a position up here at Beaufrere. I had never had Beaufrere wines, but I'd seen their wines in the store. They were more money than I could afford at the time. They're still more money than I can afford, but and I thought it was an interesting posting. I said this could be interesting. I was always kind of curious about Oregon and what was going on up here, but I never had the time to come up here and check it out. I was trying to get through the program down in Fresno State as quickly as possible, and so
Sure.
piling on the units and part-time work and all the above. So anyway, got a phone call from Mike Etzel at Beaufrere, and we talked a little bit, and then we decided that we'd correspond a little bit. So I wrote him some things. I didn't necessarily think it was going to go. Had no idea where it might go. Didn't necessarily think it was going to go too far. But yeah, it was funny. I had an offer from a winery for a winery in the Napa Valley. We talked terms and everything, and I think this was on a Wednesday, and I said, well, let me talk it over. Sounds good. I'll talk it over with my fiance at the time. I'll let you know tomorrow. Okay, good. 7:30 the next morning, I had a call from Mike. Hello. And at that point, he was interested in maybe having me come up for an interview. So my fiance and I were on a plane Friday morning. I kind of put off the Napa folk. Flew up Friday morning, spent Friday and Saturday with Mike, and by Monday it was a done deal. So
Amazing.
You know, one of those things where your life changes over in a weekend.
Sure.
But you know, I think I call it a fluke just because, you know, what is now 16 years ago, just the sheer number of jobs available in California compared to Oregon. I mean, and to this day, obviously, there's many more jobs to be had in California than there are in Oregon, but there's certainly a lot more jobs today in Oregon than there were back in 2001.
True.
So from that standpoint, it's where I never really expected to land in Oregon, but it just happened to be the right opportunity. So
tell us about your time at Beaufrere.
So here we are. So that was a great time. I was Mike's assistant winemaker from 2001 through 2006. Great combination of you know, winery work and a lot of work in the vineyard too. So Mike was a great mentor, and that's where I really, especially the viticultural side of things, learned so much all the way around. But you know, I'd say my focus prior to going there was more on the winery end. So being able to bring in the whole viticultural element at that point was a great opportunity. And that's something I think that I always kind of wanted, that connection, and one foot in the vineyard and one foot in the winery. And it's not, those types of positions don't always present themselves too frequently.
Sure.
Might be a little more common up here, just in the scale and the size of wineries, so you end up doing a little of everything. But it was a great 6 years there, getting to taste with Robert Parker when he would come out once a year to work on the blends. That was very interesting too. So a good time, but I think, you know, after about, like I said, 6 vintages at that point, Mike wasn't really ready to step aside, so to speak, nor should he have. And I think I was kind of looking for a new opportunity and some bigger shoes to put my feet in.
Sure. And so how did you find Colin Clemens?
Well, initially, actually, I spent 1 year in between Beaufrere and Colin Clemens. I worked with the folks who had purchased Beacon Hill from Tony Soder. And unfortunately, at a certain point, I kind of could tell that project wasn't going so well. And then Joe Stark approached me that summer about the project here at Colin Clemens. And I had met Joe through Mike, because Mike Etzel had done some consulting for Joe on the initial property development and planting of this piece. Joe had already acquired the piece, but he worked with Mike for a couple years there in planning out the initial development. So that's where I got to know Joe a little bit. And his son came in 2005 and worked harvest with us at Beaufrere. So when Joe approached me in 2007, and I came out and saw the property and thought it was a great opportunity. So I finished out the year at Beacon Hill and made the 2007 vintages of wine for them. Got everything buttoned up and put in barrel, and then moved over here. So then I assumed the role of both winemaker and vineyard manager when I got here in 2008, which was the first vintage of Colin Clemens.
So what's that like doing both?
It's busy. I guess in the early years it was a little easier because at that point it was more of a viticulture and property development project at that point than a winery. Mm-hmm. The winery had not been built yet, so I was in on some of the whole construction project and the planning and a lot of working out some of the systems that we have here for that. But a lot of my time was spent in the vineyard. And then at that point there were 25 acres planted, and so that first year we then planted an additional 6 acres. And that's what was taking up my time, because that vintage was a great vintage and a great vintage to start on, but we made that wine over in the tractor barn over here. Harvesting about 10 tons of fruit off 23 acres, so only about 24 barrels of wine.
Sure.
So it's obviously grown since then considerably.
Is it something you're going to be able to keep doing as it grows? Will you have to eventually split your duties differently?
Yeah, I think my role here has changed. It's a constantly evolving thing. Also because now that there's wine and a product to sell, there's no way for the winemaker to get out of having to be involved in some of that effort as well. So we'll have to see. We're now, with everything we just planted this spring, right at about 60 acres.
Wow.
And so we'll still be making around 7,000 cases of wine this year, but we'll probably be growing up to about 10,000. But we've been able to train some good people. My vineyard foreman, who I rely on immensely, is someone who came here who didn't have a background in plants, but I've worked hand in hand with him for this will be our 10th year.
Wow.
And he's exceptional. He's also exceptional in the winery. So we'll see. It does get harder and harder, but so far we're managing to keep up.
Sure. So tell me about the vineyard a little bit. What makes it special?
Interesting property, a fairly dramatic property, as you can see looking around. Mm-hmm. I think the elevations here, we go from about 350 feet on the bottom to just over 650 feet at the high point. A mix of soils, most of them predominantly sedimentary soils. There are a couple spots of volcanic soil, but most of the soils are classified sedimentary. We have a boatload of rock, and all the rock is basalt.
Interesting.
So you have this mix of sedimentary soils and volcanic rock. And I think the theory is that rock would have sloughed off from Bald Peak, which sits right above us. That's Bald Peak State Park right there.
Okay.
So high point in the Chehalem Mountains. So at some point, the volcanic material worked its way down here. To give you an idea, a couple outfits tried to turn this place into a quarry and mine it for rock.
Wow.
There's back behind you, go up on that hill and it drops off into a big pit, which was the initial quarry back there. But there wasn't enough rock to make a viable quarry. But as I say, there's been tons of rock to break all sorts of farm implements. So, so this is not, it's not an easy piece. It hasn't been an easy piece to develop. You know, you look around, and Joe has developed this from just raw ground. I mean, it was mostly all in pasture and scrub when he acquired it. A few people, I think, historically had tried to farm bits and pieces of it, but none too successfully. I'm going to guess largely probably because of the rock content. All the roads on the property here, we have built. All the base for those roads is built with rock that has come out of the field. And if you look around, we've got quite a bit of road.
A lot of road.
We've kind of run out of road to build. So these last couple pieces that we've developed has been interesting, trying to find a place to put all the rock. You know, and the rock starts to really big stuff, and then you kind of, you know, we work down till you get to maybe somewhere around here and less, and that's the stuff you'll never get out, and that's what you coexist with. You just pick your farm implements accordingly. But yeah, it does make so between all the rock, some pretty steep angles in places, it is not the easiest piece to develop or to farm. But I think it's proven pretty quickly that it's capable of making some very, very good wine. I think stylistically, we are, in my opinion, something of a middle ground between a pure volcanic and a pure sedimentary site. Initially, I just looking at the soil survey and thinking about sedimentary soils in my experience, especially when we were getting going in 2008, young vines, thought, okay, sedimentary soils, young vines, we're going to make very dark fruited, black fruited, and very muscular, big structured, heavily structured wines. And what we made was decidedly red fruited and more elegantly structured, or delicately structured. So it was, you know, one of those great examples of you don't really know until you know. But I think that is, I think that's the influence of the volcanic rock. I think, and I didn't know. I mean, you saw all the rock around, but what is the impact going to be? And obviously, speaking in very broad brush strokes, you know, to me, like pure volcanic soil sites such as Dundee Hills tend to be more red fruited and a little more delicately structured, and the pure sedimentary soil sites, like when you cross the street to Ribbon Ridge, because we are just across the street, but the soil changes completely. You know, there's virtually no rock over there. But anyway, you know, the pure sedimentary sites, which tend to be the black fruited and bigger tannins, bigger structured wines, and we kind of, I think, fit somewhere right in the middle, which I, you know, in retrospect, I think is a nice place to be.
Sure. So when you were approaching this project to start, you said it kind of gotten started and you got hired in. How did you go about approaching learning how to kind of coexist with all the rock and coexist with the interesting elements?
Well, I guess experience is the greatest teacher, right? So, you know, looking around, at that point we had a couple tractors, there was an assortment of implements. We had a spade machine, which I actually really like spade machines. We had a rototiller. That was one thing I took a look at and said, I don't think that's going to work too well. But and I don't think I really quite understood at first how much rock we were really talking about. So after we had rattled the spade machine apart and put it back together a few times, I kind of realized that, okay, maybe we need to, this isn't going to last or work too well, so we need to consider other things. So really what we moved to and acquired at that point are bigger, heavier duty implements and things that aren't PTO driven on a tractor, things that aren't mechanical. So like big heavy discs, things that you just pick up and put down and drag through the soil. Big plows that with big beefy shanks that can penetrate a foot or so into the soil, and again, you're just lifting it up and putting it down. So things of that nature. But it's you live and learn, trial and error. We learned, I like to think, fairly quickly. I don't know. Well, if it wasn't going to work, it wasn't going to last very long. So, right,
So we saw that you really focus on kind of low yield, sustainable practice, hand-picked grapes. How did that come about, that kind of focus on, especially on the hand-picking of grapes? How did that come about?
Well, I really had no experience with mechanical harvesting at that point. And I know mechanical harvesters have come a long way. One of the reasons Joe initially chose a 7-foot row spacing as opposed to going to an even narrower, more dense spacing was with an eye to the future if labor became the issue or the critical thing, that it might be easier to potentially mechanically harvest on that row width. And I haven't really kept too abreast of, I know that technology continues to evolve too, but there certainly were a lot more options at a 7 on all implements and tractors, et cetera, at 7 feet than when you went sub 7 feet. Plus, with all the hills and side slope that we have, going to the narrower rows, you end up usually going to a higher tractor, and there's some danger in that. My experience at Beaufrere had a very profound effect on me as far as especially viticulturally, and so I was really just taking my experience there and applying it here. And the commitment to low yields, especially out of the gate here. When I got here, Joe and Vicky's sort of directive to me was we want to see what the property can do. We want to see how good it can be. And so I was okay, and the only way that I know how to make really good wine with young vines is, we're going to do a lot of soil work, number one, composting, green manuring, turning everything in. We're going to short prune the plants to begin with, keep the plants small, but try to build a nice healthy vigor into it. And by doing that, you're limiting the crop right there, because you're only utilizing maybe half of the fruiting wire. So you're only, we were only getting like 3 or 4 clusters a plant. But we did, and we took it down to 1 cluster per shoot. So we ended up with 3 or 4 clusters a plant. Is what I should have said. I think young vines can really surprise you with what they can do. Just don't ask them to do a lot of it. And we were very fortunate that 2008 was a very good vintage, but it ended up being a very successful first. The wines, and the wines are actually still drinking well today. So, but as back to low yields, I've always been kind of a believer in low yields. I do think that the depth, the layers of Pinot Noir does suffer with yield. With young vines, it's a little bit different. I mean, again, it's like they'll do good things. Don't ask them to do a lot. You don't want to put too much of a load. You'll stress the plants out, and you can end up paying for that for a number of successive vintages after that. Sure. So when they're young, we're very careful about yield and bring the vines along very, very slowly. But even with a mature plant, I still am a believer that you do lose something with yield. And so we crop our vineyard now that we've gotten to know it, and we know which blocks are typically going to produce, say, our best wines, and which blocks are going to go into our entry-level wines. We will crop the entry-level stuff a little higher versus our top cuvées.
Sure.
You have to be somewhat cognizant of the economics of it. Even though Joe would probably tell you this whole thing's like economic suicide.
Yeah.
Well, especially when you pull 10 tons off 23 acres in the first year, which is about 0.4 ton of the acre is what we yielded in '08. But that's something, especially with the young vines, again, saw at Beaufrere. I was at Beaufrere when back in 2002 when we produced the first vintage from the Upper Terrace Vineyard. And Michael, I think, was always very, very good. He always made some really exceptional wine on very, very young vines. And to me, that's all, credit to his farming and the way he went about it. And low yields were certainly a part of that.
So do you have a winemaking philosophy? You kind of talked about your vineyard philosophy a little bit here, but do you have like a winemaking philosophy as well?
Yeah, I mean, probably kind of the standard line that you probably hear all over, let the vintage and the site speak. And I guess, we hear that a lot, but I think we hear it a lot because it's true. And I want the vineyard to express itself. I think at any time you try to, as a winemaker, impose yourself on your site, you're generally going down the wrong path. You need to let, for example, if a wine wants to show me power and intensity, I want that to come from the vineyard and from me to cropping to low yields, and not from me overly extracting or working that fruit in the winery, whether it be by excessive punch downs or letting fermentations get excessively hot or anything of that nature. I think as a winemaker, you can always make the bigger wine, but did you necessarily make the best wine? And so I think size, especially in the context of Pinot Noir, is something that if you're chasing size, you're usually, I think, not going to come out on the winning end of things. And so if your site doesn't want to be big, don't try to make it big.
Is that mostly just an experience? You kind of learn your site and learn what it can do?
I think it is. I mean, but I think if you approach things with a gentle hand, and if you go easy, especially from the beginning, and get a sense of what you have, then maybe as you progress, you could perhaps dial it up, so to speak. But you're never really going to have a good handle on what you have unless if you go into it kind of full bore and extraction, I don't think you're gonna miss probably the true essence of what you have to work with. So, and I saw that my time at Beaufrere, the wines we would make from Beaufrere, the wines from fruit that we would purchase, like especially older vine Dundee Hill stuff. I mean, that stuff, it does not want to be big, and it starts with the color. It tends to be paler. It's not the overall tannin and phenolic profile is just so much less. So I think that's the beauty of it. personally, but and I think sometimes that's it's a tricky thing, because I think there's a perception, and it's somewhat reality, that the market wants or gravitates towards bigger wines. But I found actually that and I think even as time has gone on, that there's definitely an audience for the more delicate expressions and styles of Pinot Noir, more so than I initially thought.
So in addition to Pinot Noir, you're also doing Chardonnay here? Yeah.
We have planted about 6 acres of Chardonnay now. Anything
else?
Nope.
Just Pinot?
Pinot and Chardonnay.
And why the focus just so specifically on those?
Joe was of the opinion he really wanted to focus on something. Pinot Noir, obviously, which is the bulk of what we do. We decided that when we got into white wines, that we were intrigued mostly by the potential of Chardonnay in the Willamette Valley. We think it is the right place to be growing Chardonnay. I agree with that. And I've just seen a lot of, we'd rather do a few things and do them very well than to dabble. And as a winemaker, I'm not really one who likes to dabble too much. I know some guys do, or some people do, but I'm not really one of them. I don't really like making, especially lots of tiny experimental lots of things. If I'm going to do something, I want to have at least there's sort of a minimum scale, I think, that I like to work on. If I can't produce at least, fill up a good sized fermenter, or a couple tons of something, and walk out with 4 or 5 barrels of it, it kind of becomes a little more of a headache. But and then as far as how that translates to marketing, of course, too.
Sure. Sure.
So
in addition to what you do here, you also have your own label. So tell us how that differs from what you're doing here.
I do. So it's a very tiny project. It just goes under my name, Steve Goff. And as this project, Colin Clemens, is entirely estate-based, initially we sourced a little fruit for the rosé we make. We make a dry rosé, and initially we were sourcing a little fruit for Chardonnay just to get started. But starting in 2017, everything will be estate grown. But because, mostly with the Pinot Noir, because we've always been estate grown on the Pinot Noir. So my label was also my opportunity to go and work with fruit from other vineyards in different AVAs and different soils, and get to explore and play around a little bit. And I've been in the valley long enough that I had some nice relationships with some good growers, Dick Shea and Andy Humphrey, who farms the Weber Vineyard over in Dundee Hills. And it's interesting to me on a lot of levels. I mean, it's fun to do. It's fun to make wines from other places, and I also like the thing I found too is I like having my nose in a couple other vineyards. It's always interesting to see what other people are doing and how that turns out, and then compare it to what we're doing here. And sometimes you get some good ideas of, hey, they look like they're doing that really well and it seems to be working really well. Maybe we should try that over here. So it's had it's fulfilled a number of different things. Lets me scratch a few itches and gives a little something, some additional knowledge back in return.
So what have you noticed that's, you've talked a little bit about this before, but what is different about the Pinots that you're growing from the different AVAs?
Well, the Weber Vineyard, own-rooted 35, I think what I'm working with is 35-year-old own-rooted Pommard. And, that just is a different animal altogether. And it is the much more elegant, more delicate wine. It's rare that you would make, some years the color is even quite pale. It's rare that you would make a deep dark. It's not what that vineyard, it's not what those soils do. Even in the hot years, as other vineyards sugars are starting to spike, that vineyard just kind of moves to the beat of its own drummer. It really does. And even in some of these warm years, we'll pick it 2 weeks later and it's 23 or 23 and a half bricks. So an interesting wine, a wine that I always, I worked with that fruit when I was at Beaufrere. I always liked it. I was always intrigued by it. It has taken a little different approach as far as the farming, and I think figuring out the farming element of it. And we do those old vines on a wider spacing. I think it's an 8x6 spacing. We found actually, and just the nature of those soils, deeper root systems, more water availability, more vigor. Actually, that site has proven to be somewhat, run a little counter to my general philosophies on yield, because we have found that we do need to put a little more fruit on those vines just to make them work a little bit more.
Interesting.
And then, of course, just going over to, working over the Shea Vineyard into a pure sedimentary site. I always, again, worked with that fruit from the time I got here in 2001. Always liked that vineyard and what it does. So, yeah, it is that I would say, as far as farming, and I'd say more similar in approach to what we do here to what's going over there versus what we need to do over in Dunny Hills is a little different.
So you've been in the valley for a little over 15 years now. Tell me about, other than just pure size, tell me about some of the changes you've seen in the Willamette Valley and in the Oregon wine industry since you've been a part of it.
Yeah, it does keep growing, doesn't it? I can't even keep up with this. Every day you drive by, there's a new vineyard. Who's that? I have no idea. I've kind of got my hands full here, so I don't.
Sure.
But to me, the overall quality across the board, viticulturally and in the winery, just continues to rise. I know that when I first got here in 01, the valley still really felt mom and pop. And I think, some people probably lament that some of that element might be, getting lost, or as the valley gets bigger and bigger players come into the market. But with some of the mom and pop also came, I think, some more variable quality across the board. But even a lot of the small operations too, I think, as things have gone, have raised their game. And I think because they've had to, and some of the ones who didn't have gone away. To me, that's all just the natural evolution of the place. And so, I think when I look at vintages like 2011, probably what is the coldest vintage on record, probably the latest pick dates on average. I didn't start picking here till the 26th of October. I've never...
Goodness.
Yeah, and to be receiving fruit in November. But I think about that vintage and I think, what if 2011 happened 10 or 15? I don't even think in 01 we would have been able to handle it as well. And I think if you went back into another 5 or 10 years, it would have even gotten worse. And so you see it in the quality of the wines, even in the tough years. So that, where people are still making good wines in tough years. And I think that, I'm pretty familiar with pretty much all the vintages of the 90s. I've had all those wines. In the 80s, I'm less familiar with. I've kind of heard some of the horror stories, heard some of the successes, but I've heard some sort of the horror stories. So I think, again, knowledge, experience, and it's paid off. People have learned from the past. People have brought in better technology, better ideas, better practices. But yeah, it's I think 11 and 10 or 15, if that had happened 10 or 15, that would have been scary.
So what happens next? What does the wine industry look like in 10, 15 years from now?
Good question. I don't know. Is it going to look radically different than where we are right now? I don't know if it's going to be radically different. I mean, it seems like there's this interest of larger entities coming into play. That trend's probably going to continue. I'm sure that could also get interrupted by whatever economic cycle we're in at the moment, and it's probably going to continue. But I don't look at that as a bad thing. To me, there's still lots of room for Oregon to grow, especially out in the marketplace as a category. I think, here we're surrounded by it, and we live in our bubble, and it's and you leave the bubble and you realize, despite how much work has gone on, how much more there still is to do about telling the Oregon, not just telling the story, but generating the awareness and getting the wines out there, which I think, probably the thing that maybe, concern me the most moving forward is what I see happening out in with wine sales and distribution, and that's effect on smaller sized wineries, because we are still, on the whole, really small. I mean, there's I don't know what the average size winery in Oregon is, but it's got to be sub 10,000 cases.
Yeah, probably.
And so, with all the consolidation that I see going on in distribution, and I see all these vineyards going in, and I do wonder, where's all this fruit going to go? Because making it on a certain part is the fun part, and selling it is the really hard part. And I think it's getting harder and harder for small producers to kind of tap into really good distribution channels. We've even seen that here at Colin Clemens. The products, the wines have been, in general, very well received, very well reviewed. We've gotten, I'd say, our good share of accolades. It's still hard for us to break into markets. And so that'd be the trend that I think is, and then maybe that's what's going to drive some of the bigger entities that continue to come in here, because I think that's one of the big, a player like Kendall Jackson has a lot of, they've got a lot of good people working for them, and there's a lot of experience and know-how on the production side of things. But I think where they have a tremendous advantage is in their sales and marketing departments and so on. But when I look at the big players too, I almost think the Valley needs them to a certain extent. And you think about all that marketing power that they bring, and I think the Valley still needs that, and they're going to be out there beating the drum, and it's good.
So without that behind you, and with all of the competition you have, especially local competition you have, how do you make a name for yourself as a small production winery?
Well, it's not easy. I think you have to work very hard at it, and you have to work on all fronts. But I think a lot, grassroots marketing, I think, can really get kind of overlooked. It can do a lot for you on the small scale, and a lot of it's just getting out and getting your name out there. I mean, the quality has to be in the bottle. The competition is such that you need to be real about what you're doing and how you're pricing it. Mm-hmm. And if anything, we've, especially being a somewhat newer player, we have really striven to over deliver. And I think we've succeeded in that. We're probably not succeeding economically in that, in a certain sense, if you know what I mean. But I think it's one element of it, and I think it's important. Mm-hmm. But it does take time. It's going to take time and persistence. Like I said, we've had plenty of success with the major wine critics, Spectator, Advocate, Tanzer, but you need to find other outlets to tell your story, and other venues to, if you're sitting around waiting for the score to make you, it's got to be one hell of a score. Because the scores don't move the needle the way they used to either.
A lot of good wine.
There's a lot of good wine. But I remember, when I first got here, came up here in 2001 and was interviewing at Beaufrere, I think they had just gotten 94 points on the 99 vintage, which I think was the highest from the Spectator, which is the highest that they had received at that point. And that was kind of a buzz, and that got the phone ringing. And now, wow, 94, if you're not priced too high, will still get the phone to ring. But if you come out and say you're $40-50 and you get a 92, the phone doesn't ring. So that whole element and dynamic has definitely changed, and I've seen. So some good old-fashioned shoe leather too, and that's I think the frustrating part about selling wine through distribution. Once you get distribution, mm-hmm. is that you got to go to the market and then sell your wine, because those guys aren't going to make it happen for you. So that's a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of expense. But you have to go and visit those markets repeatedly, and start developing the relationships in those markets. Mm-hmm. If you're expecting the distributor to do all the work for you, it doesn't happen. So I think all those combination, and of course we've all seen the importance of the direct-to-consumer element of it. So I think if you want to succeed, you've got to be working on all fronts.
Sure. Tasting
room, winery experience, direct-to-consumer experience, and then depending on what your size is, at a certain point you're really going to have to wrestle with the national scene and the 3-tier distribution system. There's no way around it that I've seen in my experience. I think we're all searching for it.
Sure.
And maybe if you want to turn out 1,000 or 2,000 cases, and you've got to, you could sell it all out your door and through a tasting room, and that's fine. But we don't see less and less of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what's next for Colin Clemens then? What's in the future?
Well, we still have, we have 41, we will have 47, we'll have 50 producing acres. We still have blocks that have yet to produce, so we're still tapping into new material over the next few years. I think you'll slowly see our overall production rise. But, it's, the development of the property is pretty much complete. We maybe have an acre or two that left to plant. So waiting for the plantings we've done the last couple of years to start coming into production and then into maturity, and seeing where, in the next, I don't see any radical changes. Just continuing to explore what's here and see where that takes us.
What advice would you have for someone who wanted to make wine in Oregon?
On what level? Like someone looking to get into the industry?
Sure. Look at someone looking to get into the industry.
I would encourage them to go get some formal education in it and to study it. I think that there's a trend. There are plenty of people who make wine and continue to make wine who don't come out of one of the big programs or one of the formal programs, and some of them do quite well. Most of those people have also typically probably been fortunate enough to also have come across a very good mentor. And while experience is the ultimate teacher, and finding a good mentor and someone to learn under, I think, is critical, I would also encourage them to acquire some of the science and what you might call the more formal education. I think there's kind of currently a bit of a trend that's almost anti that, and I think we see that up here in Oregon a fair amount. And especially people who are coming, whether they're coming from a restaurant background or something like that, and they dive into winemaking and saying that you don't need the other side of it. But of course, when things start going wrong, who do they tend to lean on? So I think it's always a blend of the two. And I think, where would the California wine industry be, if it wasn't for UC Davis and Fresno State and places like that. And of course, we have the program here at Oregon State and Chemeketa. And I think that's a really important component of it that, just like I said, it's getting a little short shrift lately. But but the combination of that, and again, finding someone to learn under, because there is that whole craft to it. And I think also just developing, having a really good sense about wine in general, really exploring wines and tasting wines, developing what I call an aesthetic about wine, where you have that sense of, you understand sort of wine from a variety of contexts and where you fit in, and not just Oregon wine, but California wine and Italian wine and French wine and Spanish wine and of course Southern Hemisphere even is coming on. But I think that's really important. I think that's where you see some of the people who come more from and I have a bit of a restaurant background too before I went, but went back to school, chose to go back to school for it, and I toyed around with the idea of not doing that, but in hindsight, I'm glad that I did. But I think some of the folks who have succeeded from that world, the good ones, I think, is that they have a good a general good understanding of the aesthetic of wine.
Sure. That's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you'd like to say, or anything I should have asked that I didn't, as our plane flies over our head here? Any final words?
I don't think so.
All right.
No.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We
Yeah.
really appreciate it. Thank you for all the great answers.